Hello, BookTube. It's day 5 of Nonfiction November. That's an event hosted by Jemma at Nonfiction Books and Olive at a Book Olive, in which they encourage you to read more nonfiction in the month of November. Uh, and I've been making nonfiction recommendations since November started, and some of you have noticed they're going in kind of rough chronological order, and I'm afraid that that yesterday, today, and tomorrow represent perhaps the bottom of the darkest part of that tunnel before we emerge into the light. So you'll just have to bear with me. I want to recommend these two today and tomorrow. These guys that don't get recommended ever by anybody, not just on BookTube, but anywhere in the world. I want to recommend them because of how much joy they brought me, but I'll try and keep it brief. And the recommendation that I want to make today, BookTube, you knew this day was coming, is the Venerable Bede. He was a monk who lived for 30 years before, 30 years after, roughly the year AD 700 in the north of England, in Northumbria. Uh, and he spent his entire life in holy orders. He didn't do anything else. And he lived at a time, the place where he lived, the monastery where he spent most of his life, was a center for learning and a crossroads for learning. So he had access to a very large number of books, and also, almost as importantly, a very large number of fellow book readers at a time in the world, in the West especially, when that was at its lowest point. In 8700, it was possible, if you were well situated in a place like where he was, and had an education enough to read, and a societal position enough to read, as opposed to laboring all day long, you could, in 8700, actually come close, if not actually succeed, in reading every book then available in your world. And Bede came closer than anybody. He read everything, he copied laboriously, and he wrote like crazy. He wrote all the time. He wrote a lifetime of books. I have a picture of him here. There he is at the dog park at Jarrow, with a puppy that history has not named. uh, he's most famous for a book called the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, in which he talks about the history of the church in England. And that's his main point, but he was omnivorously curious, and his book doesn't stay on topic. So it's become a treasure trove of historical information, even non-religious information, about his England, about the England that knew itself in his day. Centuries of history that he relates. Now, he relates it through the eyeglass of ecclesiastical concentration, but still, it's a fascinating book. One of the things that recommends it is something that it doesn't recommend it to too many people in the world anymore, which is his Latin. His Latin is actually lovely, crystalline, beautiful in a way. It's definitely not classical Latin, but it's also not aping classical Latin. It's a thing unto itself. It's a shame that it's difficult to convey that, and it's also a shame that modern translators into English feel the need to subjugate that to mud plain English in order to make it in any way accessible. They already know that a 1500-year-old ecclesiastical history by a monk in northern England is going to be a hard sell no matter what. So the prevalent English language translations in the 20th century tend to play down some of the beauties that those translators encounter in Bede, and some of them in their translator's preface will actually say, "Yeah, I'm sorry that I had to jettison this, but it nevertheless had to go." I know this will sound invidious, but I believe that Bede is still waiting for his great English language translator. And he's certainly waiting still for his great English language edition. What I wouldn't give to see a big, fat Penguin Classic or Oxford Classic of Bede that wasn't just the ecclesiastical history. I would love it if someone would make a big book that had that, and then had the unabridged text of his let's say his scriptural commentaries. He wrote a ton of scriptural commentaries. They're all wonderful. They're all absolutely wonderful, especially for Christians. It kills me that Christians have never read this guy. He's an extremely lively commentator on the Bible, and especially on the New Testament, and especially on the best part of the New Testament, the book of Luke. It would be great if a big book of Bede could have those books and then large, well-annotated selections from everything else he wrote, with notes and an introduction, maybe a few pictures. That would be wonderful. I think it would go a long way towards putting Bede back in readership, where he is now gone, just gone completely. No one reads him. Almost no one's ever heard of him. Although he's got the popularity of Beyonce compared to the guy we're doing tomorrow. But anyway, I wanted, as uphill a battle as it is, I wanted for this day 5 of Nonfiction November to make just a brief recommendation of the Venerable Bede. Even in a slightly boring English translation, and even his most famous work, The Ecclesiastical History of the English People, you can find that book in the Penguin Classic that Penguin did. I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head if Oxford ever did one. I don't think Bantam ever did one. I don't think Signet ever did one. The editions of Bede, that you might be able to find secondhand or at your library in America are probably very paltry. Once upon a time, I think it was published in England, there was an oversized paperback called the Illustrated Bede. If you can find that, the translation is still a little boring, but it was a lavish pictorial production, and that's great. That will help you. I freely admit that when it comes to Bede, you might need a little help, but it's worth it. He's worth it. As with some of the earlier writers that I've talked about here, when you read him, it doesn't take long or much of a work of your imagination to become aware of the fact that you're in the presence of a real mind, a real person. After you've read him for a little bit, just a few stories, he doesn't feel like a figure of antiquity anymore. It feels like you're in the presence of an actively inquiring, smart mind. And that's always worthwhile to read, in my opinion. But anyway, that's my recommendation for today for Nonfiction November. I want you to fasten your seatbelts for tomorrow, in which you get a double-barreled dose of tedium, and then things get bright and sexy again. So don't you worry. Thank you, Book 2.